Hello everybody, it's Stephen and Walter here for another episode in So Chatty, episode 5. And this week we're going to talk about the Janome and Elna Airthread Sergers, and we're going to talk about the cover stitch machine. Both of these machines are machines that Walter uses quite a bit when he's doing his garment sewing. As a quilter, I have never used a cover stitch machine, so I'm going to find out all about it today just like you are. And as far as the serger is concerned, well, I don't really use that in quilting, although I have used it to do napkins and some other things as well. So really, I think these two machines are for you who do garment sewing. So, and just to let you know what else we're going to talk about on this show, we've got some new tips. One of them is how I found out how to fix my automatic threader on my sewing machine. And I'm looking at my notes here. And update about the dual feed button on your Janome, if you have that option for the dual, what do they call it? The dual feed? I always call it the dual feed. It's the
Accu-Feed.
Accu-Feed, yeah, system. Because something else that I found out on the weekend when I was at a virtual retreat. And I'm going to talk about how I got into sewing. And yeah, so we've got a lot to go here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire Walter up because he's going to be the person talking to you chiefly about all of these things today. And move the camera to new position. Okay, so here are the two machines. This is the Elna 864 air threader. And we'll explain what air threading means in a moment. But the equivalent model to this in the Janome line is the Janome Airthreader 2000D. They're both basically the same machine. Janome makes both of them. But one's Elna, one's Janome. And over here we have the Janome cover stitch machine. And what number is that one?
This is the actually the bottom of the line cover stitch machine called the Coverpro 900 CPX. And what makes it the bottom of the line one is it's a 2-needle cover stitch machine as opposed to a 3-needle cover stitch machine.
Okay, well, we'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes, but let's start with talking about the Serger. So, you're on. Tell us all about this.
This is my new Serger, and it's what they call an Airthread Serger, and it's the top of the line. Actually, Janome makes it, and it's one called the Airthread 2000, and it's their latest air threader. It's their only air threader machine, which is basically their top of the line serger. And Janome owns the company Elna and also makes the same serger under the Elna name. So when I went to purchase the serger, the only one that our dealer had available was the Elna, which is exactly the same as the Janome brand. So I took the Elna brand.
And although we don't have the other air threader up here because it's downstairs in my sewing room, it looks exactly like this with the exception of the color.
Yeah, the color on the Janome, this part, the very top part here, is actually a silver color. But other than that, the Janome branding, it's exactly the same machine.
Yeah. So whatever we say about this machine applies to the Janome 2000 as well. Okay, carry on.
Okay, now why I decided to buy this serger is I was using an older serger, which is that one over there, right?
This one right here.
Yeah, and what's different between the two work actually very well, and the old one works very well as well, but the only difference is between that one and the newer one is this one's much easier to thread. The older one that I have is much more difficult to thread, and it's the lower looper that's difficult to thread.
And the lower looper on this older machine is located way under that plastic bracket.
Yeah.
Open this up.
When you open this up, the lower looper is in here, and for you to thread it is you have to manipulate a little loops underneath both sides of this threader to get it to thread properly. It's not that difficult. You can do it. It's not a big issue. And that isn't really the big reason why I went for the new machine. The other part of the problem with the older machine is that for me to switch from a what they call a regular stitch to a rolled hem stitch, on the old machine I have to take the needle plate out. And that's still not a terrible thing, but if I want to adjust the knife blade by taking the knife down or like taking out the cutting ability or adjusting the width of the knife, the old machine I have to actually get a wrench in there and screw around with the settings on it, and it can be a bit of a nuisance if I do that. And actually, that is something I do once in a while. And so on this new machine, I just have to turn a knob, and I can adjust the cutting width, and I can take the knife down,
Okay.
which is the two things that I think are the most important.
Okay, so we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
So let's just basically talk about the layout of this machine.
Okay, what a serger does is it gives you, a lot of times when you look on the inside of your clothes, you'll find this really neat little they call it an overlock stitch. It's a strange stitch that usually is used on stretchy material, like to put your sleeves in or other things, and it gives you a stretch stitch. And what it does too is on the sergers, there's a knife blade in there that will cut the edge of your fabric as you're going along, which is a bonus because it then gives you a nice even seam.
So what you're saying is a serger sews and cuts at the same time.
Yes, it does. And you have options where if you decide you don't want to cut for some reason, you can take it so that the knife doesn't cut. And that's where you bring the knife blade down or something like that. You don't have to cut.
Okay. So this, by looks of things, you have 4 spools of thread on here. So, excuse me. Let's talk about the threads, first of all. Why 4?
Why 4? You have, on the sergers, you have something called a lower looper. And then there's another thing called an upper looper, which is basically what's replacing your bobbin in a sewing machine. And then you have 2 needles in it, a right needle and a left needle. So the 4 needles will give you the proper overlock stitch. You can use it. There are other overlock stitches where you can use it with 3 needles, but usually most machines use the 4 needle overlock stitch.
Okay, so we're using a term here. We're using the term overlock. So what that really means is that it binds your edge so it won't fray as it sews, right? So can you show us an example of what that looks like on the other piece of fabric?
So yeah, I'll turn it on. I've got it threaded now with black threads. That's probably not a good fabric to use, but I'll use it with a lighter thread. And I'll just put my fabric in, right? And there's if you look carefully, I'm going to take this out. If you look carefully on this machine, the knife blade is right here, and it bounces up and down, and will cut the fabric. So what I'll do is I'll put a piece of fabric in, right, and I'll put the foot down, right. And now I'm going to cut this fabric and overlock it at the same time. And what I did was I created a stitch. Then if you look at the inside of your clothing, most clothing, especially knitted materials, you will see a stitch that's similar to this.
So you see it finishes it off, so there'll be no raveling.
Yeah, and this isn't stretchy material, but if it was stretchy material, it would stretch.
Okay. Now, that's a basic stitch on that machine.
Stretchy material.
It's gone over here.
I don't have any stretchy material.
Okay, so Walter now has a piece of stretchy fabric.
Stretchy fabric, it's jersey. And I will do exactly the same thing as I just did, except I will sew on jersey. Of course, I got jersey that's not cooperating. Oops, hang on. Okay, so now I've got the same edge on jersey. And
just this, I want to hold it up here so you can see the edge. There's the edge, okay.
And if you notice here, as I can pull at the stitches, and it stretches alongside with the material. So it does a really nice job of sewing stretch material and giving you stretch.
Okay. Now that's a basic overlock stitch, but this machine will also do something called a rolled hem. Now you have to set it up for a rolled hem, but when would you want to use a rolled hem? Okay, sorry about that. Walter had to get an example here. So here is a napkin that he made some time ago, and this is what we call a rolled hem.
Now on the edge of the napkin, of course I got one that you probably can't see very well, is you get a special stitch, and what happens is you switch the machine over to use three threads. You only use one needle, and it's a special stitch, and it just makes a very dense stitch that rolls over the edge of the fabric so that you get a nice edging for things like napkins.
And that's really why I got into using a serger, and I used the old one we showed you earlier when I first got into this, because I wanted to make my own napkins, because I couldn't find any that I liked or that I could afford. And we use a lot of cloth napkins. So,
and what else is nice with the serger is, now I don't use it much. I use it for t-shirts and jerseys and sweatshirts to make this nice stitch on the side of the sweatshirts. But that's for my purposes. But for ladies, if they're sewing leggings or if they're sewing swimsuits or something like that, then this is an ideal machine to use for this as well.
Okay. So we basically talked about the fact this machine can cut the fabric as it's sewing it. It does an overlock or a rolled hem stitch, and it takes 3 to 4 spools of thread. So let's just talk about the thread. Is this a special thread for this machine, or can you use any kind of thread with this?
You can actually use pretty much any kind of thread, but generally a lot of times people use what they call an overlock thread, which is a little bit thinner than a regular sewing thread and comes in large spools. But you can actually use pretty much any thread that you want for a more decorative look.
So if you want to use metallic threads, for example.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if you would be able to use metallic threads. I've never used them. But I know that you can use things like woolly nylon, and you can use things like embroidery thread in it. Because actually in these napkins I used embroidery thread in them to do the rolled hem. So you can actually use all kinds of different kinds of threads to make it more decorative if you like.
Yeah, I was going to say you would do that when someone's going to actually see the seam or the stitching.
But for just general stitching, like the inside of hems and that, I just use the overlock thread that I purchased. And it's a very economical thread to buy, because you would think it's an expensive proposition to buy all this thread. But for a clone, usually a clone sells about $2 to $3 a clone for this kind of thread.
It is a less expensive thread than your regular thread that you might use in quilting or something like that. Okay, so we've talked about the threads. We've talked about the overall layout. As you can see, it's a very simplistic machine. There are a couple of switches and buttons and knobs on this that do different things, but we'll save that for a little bit later on, because right now I think we should direct our attention to the needles. And you said this takes 2 needles, and there they are. Right, oops, there. Okay, we're in an awkward position.
Okay, yeah, there's the 2 needles.
Okay, just let me get. So you can see the 2 needles in the machine. Now, not always do you need 2 needles. If you're doing an overlock stitch, you use 2 needles. Well, you can do a three thread overlock as well. It depends on how wide a stitch you want, and there's other adjustments. And we're not going to get into those adjustments about that today. We're giving more or less an overview of what this machine is all about. But okay, so 2 needles, but you can operate it with just 1 as well, given whatever the project is you're working with. Okay, so up here we've got a whole bunch of dials, and these are what?
Your tension dials.
Okay.
And different tension settings will adjust the width of the stitch, or sometimes you need to. Most of the time, I don't have to adjust them, but most you can adjust them to give you different materials might stitch differently. So you have to adjust it so that you get your best optimal stitch for your fabric. And this comes with experience. You have to sort of like look at your stitches and see if it's stitching properly or not, and then adjust the dials accordingly.
So for the most part, you can just leave them. What's the neutral setting? 3?
The neutral setting's supposed to be 3 on this one, but I have the 2 needles set at 3, and I have the upper looper and lower looper set at 4 because it seems to work better for my machine.
Okay, so each one of these dials runs a needle or a looper. So let's, starting from the left, just tell us what each one of these.
Okay, this would be your your left needle. This would be your right needle. This is what you call the upper looper, and this is what you call the lower looper. When you thread this machine, you're supposed to thread it the lower looper first, then the upper looper, then the left needle, right needle, and then the left needle.
Okay, and you can see there are channels here, and there's a thread stand, and they come down through the channels, and now this is where it gets interesting.
See, in this machine is a little different because instead of the upper and lower loopers are threaded by an Airthread system. And all this means is that when I'm doing the threading, I take one of these threads and put it in the hole, and it sucks it through the hole and sucks it through the machine, and automatically threads.
So basically, you put in about a few centimeters of your thread into this hole. There's 2 holes, one for the left needle, or one for the
lower looper.
Lower looper is the first one.
Lower looper is this one, and the upper looper is this one.
So, and you see there's a switch here below. So you push that switch over to whichever hole you're threading, and you thread it with the lower looper first. So the hole that's on the extreme right, you would push that little button over.
Mm-hmm. This goes for threading the lower looper, and then you have to pull this up and down again, and it basically is a pump, and it'll suck the air through.
But what I'm saying is this dial here has to be turned.
Oh yeah,
for whichever hole
this has to be, yes.
Yeah. So right there. So then he just brings up that lever, brings it down. It creates a suction of air. It sucks the thread into the machine through a series of little tubes. And if you look,
there's
right
all
here,
these tubes, right? So,
and pulls it up out here on the top. Whereas this older machine, you have to do all this manually, and it's very, very awkward to get in underneath there for the lower looper, especially. It's a lot of manipulating. I know, because first time I ever tried to thread that machine, it took me about 3 hours to figure it out, and a lot of cursing and swearing.
Now, mind you, once you get the hang of threading the older machine, you can do it pretty quick. It's just the lower looper is actually very frustrating to try, and it's hit and miss when you're trying to thread it, and there's a lot of cursing and swearing.
Well, the other thing too that I found was once I had this machine set up, I did not want to change my threads because of having the hell I had to go through to rethread it. So you ended up basically doing your overlocking stitches and your rolled hems, that's what I was using it for mostly, in sort of a neutral thread, one that went with all my colors. On this machine, no such fear. I can customize my colors to whatever I want because I know it's not going to take me long to thread it.
Now, mind you, the newer machines, that's the pink one there is a very old machine. And the newer overlock machines, the lesser models than the Airthredder, do have an easier way of threading the lower looper. than that model, the older model that I had.
So yes, it's going to be cheaper if you buy one that isn't an Airthread.
This Airthread is the top of the line for both Elna and Janome, and it is pretty pricey compared to what a bit more basic overlocker machine is.
Yeah.
And a basic overlocker machine will do a lot of the things as well. Actually, I wasn't originally going to buy this one. I was going to buy a lower model, just because I didn't really mind threading it, other than the lower looper on the old one was much more difficult. The newer ones that they have out, the lower loopers are much easier to thread. So, there wasn't really a whole lot in stock these days, so I decided I could afford it, that I'd buy the air threader. But it's much easier to thread.
So we've talked about the lower and the upper loopers, how you thread those, but there is also an automatic threader for the needles on here as well, which is a little different from the ones that you're used to on your sewing machine, because you're threading 2 needles, but you thread 1 needle at a time, and there's a little adjustment. You push the little bar that's right there that says left and right to whichever needle you're going to thread first, and basically it works from that point. It works very much the same as a threader on any other Janome machine. So it makes quick work of having to do something that used to be somewhat tricky and cumbersome.
Yeah, whereas the old machine and even the other machines that you buy, there is no, as far as I know, there isn't any assistance for threading any of the needles on them.
So the other thing too that Walter already mentioned was about the fact that you can run a serger without cutting fabric. And to do that, you usually have to drop your blades down. Well, you can do this on this machine very easily with basically the turn of a dial.
Yeah.
You can do this very easily.
Yeah, there we go.
With a turn of a dial.
I just turned the knife blade down.
So now it won't cut the fabric. It'll just do.
It will just yeah.
Now, what would be an occasion when you wouldn't want it to cut your fabric?
Well, for instance, if you're serging, and somehow the fabric didn't catch in there, and if your fabric doesn't catch, you'll have serging, and when you open it up, there will be a hole in your fabric on this side, right? So rather than reserging the entire project, you might just want to reserge one section of it. And what happens when you do that is the cutter cuts ahead of the serge. So what happens is no matter how hard you try and reserge that one section, you'll always end up with a hole in it. So what I've done is to reserge a small section of it, I will turn the knife blade down so that it doesn't cut.
You can also adjust in here the width of the stitch too. So if you want a narrow, especially when you're doing a rolled hem, if you want a narrow rolled hem or a little wider one, you can adjust that with these controls that are in the side. We're not going to show you how to do that.
There may also be a situation where you need a certain width of fabric and you're afraid that you're going to cut off too much using the knife, where you can take the knife down to ensure that it's not going to cut the edge.
Now, one of the things I find when I'm using a serger is lining up the edge of my fabric so I cut off just what I need. And that does take a little bit of practice, but you can see on here, if I can get a little closer, there are marks that you can use to line up, and on the foot as well. So once you get familiar with your machine, you've practiced a few times, you can cut fairly straight on that.
What's nice is if you've got fabric coming through and you've got just little bits of fabric hanging off the edge here or something from or what do you call it, when your fabric unravels a bit, frays a bit, it will take all the frayed edges off of the edge of the fabric. So
again, that takes a little bit of practice because it's easy enough to cut through your threads and things like that too, but it's not that hard. You can do it fairly readily. Okay, on the side of the machine, you're going to see there's a couple of dials. One is the flywheel, the big one, and that works very much the same as it does on a regular sewing machine. But you have 2 knobs here with markings on that, and these have to do with the tension. on your system.
Now, and it also has to do with when you switch it to a rolled hem.
Yeah, you have to adjust those. But your book that comes with it will tell you when you need to use those dials. Quite frankly, when I use a serger, I very seldom have to touch these dials once they've been set up for whatever I want to do. I don't know about with garment sewing, whether you have to
I haven't really had to do, well, this machine's fairly new to me. I haven't used it a lot. But I haven't yet had to play around with the dials.
So the thing here is, once you've had a serger, you can do an overlock stitch on some sewing machines. My Janome M7 and the S7 will both do an overlock type of stitch, but of course it doesn't cut fabric. And it's not quite as nice as doing it on a serger itself. So once you had a serger, you'll kind of wonder how you didn't live with it before. And for those of you that are quilters, you can serge a quilt. You can piece pieces together using the serger. However, you're kind of limited to your design in that case. But it can be done. And there are videos on YouTube showing you how to do that. So there's another machine over here that looks like a serger, but this really isn't a serger. And the one thing that makes this machine a bit different from the serger is it does not cut fabric. So what's the point? What's this machine
doing? This machine does not do a lot. Well, it doesn't do a lot for me, but it's sort of a luxury item that people use when they do garment sewing, because basically most of what it's being used for, especially for me, is to hem garments. Okay, so there are machines that you can get that are a combination serger and a combination overlock machine, and it's supposed to be able to change from one to the other. But those machines are very expensive, and often dealers tend not to buy them because they're so expensive that it's almost cheaper to buy one of these and a serger as well. Right, so then you'd have two machines like I have here, and I don't have to convert anything.
And do the conversion is not a matter of just a little bit of a hit one switch and away you go.
No, apparently the conversion can be quite cumbersome. So, and you also, like typical with most machines that do two separate things, that one side can work really well and the other side might not be working as well. So
now I do know that I just saw a YouTube video a month or so ago where I think it was Bernina has a combination machine that actually is just a flick of a couple of buttons and it switches over. But it's a very, very expensive machine, and that's all I know about it because we're not Bernina users. But if you're interested, look up some YouTube videos. It'll be on YouTube. Showing the combination cover stitch serger type machine. So I'm not sure what they call it, but
so this is very similar in setup as a serger, other than there's no cutting blade. There is something. This one only takes 3 threads. There's something called a lower looper in here, but no upper looper, like in the serger. There's only a lower looper in this machine, and which is this part here.
Oops. I need a new tripod.
Which is this part here, that's the lower looper. And in this machine is, though they've made the lower looper easier to thread, so it just pulls out. And it's very easy to thread.
So this one is not really automatic.
No, this is a manual thread. I mean, it would have been, if they could do a lower looper on the serger like this one, it'd be just as easy to thread. So I do have to manually thread this one. This is what they call a 2-needle overlock machine, which is the entry-level machine for Janome for this. I'm usually using it to hem pants or to hem shirts or to do sleeves on shirts, the hemmed sleeves on shirts. There is also a couple of upper models. There's a Janome CPX 1000 and a Janome CPX 2000, and those are 3-needle overlock machine, or 3-needle cover stitch machines. And they have a little bit more versatility. When I asked our dealer about purchasing one of those, at the time, those ones were on back order, and she told me that for my purposes for sewing men's clothes, chances of me wanting to or having a need for a three needle cover stitch machine is unlikely, because unless I was planning to do swimwear or spandex tights or something like that, that was really the only advantage of getting a three needle one.
You're not going to make me a bikini or some spandex
No.
tights?
So what it does too is it provides, like this Serger, the advantage for doing using a cover stitch machine for doing a hem is that it offers a stretch, the ability to produce a stretch hem for stretchy material for doing jerseys or t-shirts or sweatshirts or something like that. Or I use it on just regular shirts. Instead of, a lot of people use a double needle in their sewing machine to provide a hem stitch. But this one basically takes the place of using a double needle in your sewing machine.
So you're saying that basically this is more of a luxury item, but so the people who would be most interested in buying something like this, I guess, would be people who do a lot of garment sewing.
Yes, it's a luxury item. If you have a sewing machine and you do the odd garment, you can just use a double needle to do a hem. If you want a double needle, you want that neat look for a hem on a double needle.
Yeah, because a lot of sewing machines also come where you can get a blind hem foot for it too.
Yeah, so whereas this will distinctly give you the two needle hem.
So what's that look like?
Yeah, so with threading it, this is a little weird in how you thread this. Is you have to thread the lower looper first, which is fairly easy. The guide just goes down through here. It goes through these three needle holes here, and when you have to line them up because they move around. And then you have to thread the lower looper, and then that's just it. And then you have to thread the left needle and the right needle and the left needle.
Does it have an automatic needle threader?
No, it does not.
Oh, okay. That sounds weird.
So you either use the little handy, like Dritz or whatever, needle threader, or if you're like me, I just stick it through the hole.
Because you can. All right, so let's see how this little sucker works.
Okay, so if you assume that, let's say I've folded over a hem at the bottom of a shirt, I put the hem in the bottom here and look it and just stitch on it. Okay. And what I end up with is, this is kind of crooked, but I end up with this double needle hem on the bottom. And what you end up on the back is this kind of an overlock type. You'll notice that on any commercially produced clothing has the similar kind of stitch on it. And this isn't stretchy material, but if it was stretchy material, you would be able to stretch the stitch.
Mm-hmm. Just like
yeah.
Okay.
So that's basically what this does. There's some other things you can do. You can do decorative stitches. Sometimes with sporting material, sporting jerseys and that, you'll sometimes see this kind of a stitch on the outside of it, and people sometimes do that. There's ways that you can do it. You don't have to use both needles. You can use a single needle if you want. It also offers you, when you do a single needle, it gives you a thinner stitch at the back, but again, it's a stretch stitch. So you can just have a hem with a single needle as well. That's about it. If you have a 3-needle model, you can do a 3-needle stitch, or you can do a narrow 2-needle stitch and a wide 2-needle stitch, which might be a little bit more versatile. I'm not sure.
Okay, so of course this one also has some buttons or knobs on the side, but I think those pretty much work the same way as they do on a Serger in terms of tension and the type of width of your.
There's also on this machine, there's a loose stitch and a tight stitch, and what this will help facilitate is if you're going over a bump of thick material, it will you push this over while you're going through your bump, and it loosens your stitch so that it won't stop stitching on a bump.
Okay. All right. So is there now? I noticed you've got like, is that a free arm?
Yeah. Oh yeah. This particular model comes with what they call a free arm, and if you're doing a sleeve in the round, it's a little bit easier. This part comes out, and it gives you a little bit of a space that you can go around the back.
Okay, which you do not have that option on
No,
the
I don't.
Serger.
But I've used it a couple of times, but it's not really something that you really need. It's on the Serger. I've done the same thing with the sleeves and stuff like that, and it's not that difficult to manipulate without a free arm.
You can also get different feet for the cover stitch machine that do different things, sort of like a sewing machine.
You can get a clear foot, which I haven't yet invested in. I'm not sure if I really need it or not. There's a bunch of other stitches. You can get things that help you gather. Same with on the Serger, you can get things that help you automatically gather fabric. So if you want, if you're doing kids' clothes or something, you can get it to gather. There's other things that you can do with even the Serger or whatever, where you can sew elastic in to something. So if you wanted to make a fitted sheet or something like that, you could do that.
And I think you can do a couching thing on it too, can't you?
I'm not sure.
Is it ever piping?
Piping,
yeah. Foot with it too. Now for this machine, you can also get an extended table, can't you? For the cover stitch machine?
Not that I'm aware of.
I thought I read that.
Well, I don't know if you can.
Oh, well, maybe I'm making that up. I'll have to look into that. But I thought you could. I thought you could get an extended table. But anyways, okay. So
there are accessories that you can get, which I don't really know of right this second what. But there's accessories that you can get that fit into these holes.
Oh, there's holes?
Yeah, there's holes here.
Okay.
You can get some guides that help you stitch straight and things like that. So
Hey, that's what more I was thinking of then. Oh well, I don't know, but I'll have to look it up, see if we can find an extended table or what those other things are. But anyways, that's the two machines. Now let's talk price, shall we? So this machine, the Serger, what's it range in price?
Well, I think the list price is around $2,000, but the price I paid for it is $12.99 and Canadian. And I think right now, because of the COVID thing, the price has increased to $13.99 for it, but I'm not 100% sure.
I paid $12.99 for mine as well.
The cover stitch machine, this one runs I think it's a $600 or $700. I can't remember what the list price is. It's about $700, I think. But the actual price when you go and buy it runs around $650 or $599.
Okay. Now, of course, we said this is a top of the line Serger. You don't have to spend $2,000 on a Serger. You don't have to spend $1,200 on a Serger. You can go as low as probably.
I think the base models run around $399 and $499 for one. The lowest model that you get is doesn't have the features that make it a little easier to thread. They have they're still not as easy to thread as this one. But if you run into the more moderate models that are like, I think the $499 one does actually have a thing in it where it's easier to thread. And then you get into, there's like a $699 model and there's like an $800 model. And they are geared to have extra features that make it easier to thread. And what happens with these models is the lower the model you go, the more difficult it is to do things like they don't make it easy for you to necessarily remove your knife blades or things like that. So you get it when you get in. You should get in. If you look for a model, you look for a model where it's easy to turn the knife blade down or to adjust the width of the knife blade or to switch it from a regular overlock to a rolled hem. Whether you use it or not, you have that feature available because some day down the road you may end up wanting to do that. So that's what I would look for in an overlock model, and just look at how easy it is to thread it.
So the question comes to, what kind of sewing do you do, and how much of that sewing do you do?
Yeah.
If you're into garment sewing, and if you do a lot of garment sewing, you might find a serger, a higher end serger, maybe something you should invest in. Now,
the one thing that that I did find, I didn't have much of a problems with the old machine. It does do a reasonably nice stitch and stuff like that for the serger, but if I'm in the middle of a project and I take a lot of online classes, I had at one time where my lower looper thread broke. And lower looper is difficult to thread. And usually what happens with the serger is that once your lower looper breaks, you have to unthread the entire machine and rethread it again.
Now, there is a cheater's way to thread a serger. And when I'm talking about that, that's for these older machines. But usually your dealer will not recommend this. But what it is you basically, if you're going to switch out your threads, you tie your new color of threads to the ends, like pull your ends out through the needles and tie your thread to each of those threads that are coming out of it and pull it through. But the problem with that is it can get stuck inside your machine.
Yeah,
it's actually not a good way to do it.
Actually, if you do something like that, then what you got to make sure is that you tie your knot after the thread tension machines, because if you're not get stuck in the tension discs, it can be a problem. The other part of the problem is that works great so long as your thread is still intact for you to thread it through. If you're serging and all of a sudden your thread breaks, you're
back to square one.
Yeah.
So they have their quirks, these machines. Now the cover stitch machine, price on it?
I said we went through that already. I said that it was lists around mid six. I think it's $6.99 or something like this, or $7.
Yeah, you did say that. What I want to know is though, what's the cheapest? What would they start at?
Well, this one starts at about $5.99 to $6.50, depending on what your dealer is charging for it. I think the list price is about $800 on it. When you go to the higher models, the 1000 or the 2000 models, then you're looking at $899 or $1,000 for one of those.
So basically, as you said earlier, this is a luxury item. This is for people who are very serious into garment sewing.
I know lots of garment sewers that I'm one of the few people that have one of these things. I know a lot of the garment sewers in my group will only use the double needle in a sewing machine, and because they say, well, I can't justify paying that kind of money for one of these machines. But for me, I thought, I'm doing this now. It's a luxury item. I like it. I don't have to switch my needles from.
And it's a machine, and we're men, and we like machines.
And the other thing is that you can use a double needle in your sewing machine, but it still will not give you a product like this will. It won't give you. It'll give you a similar stitch, but it won't be as nice a stitch.
Quality as that. No. Okay, so that's everything that we know right now about sergers and cover stitch machines. And what I'm saying is what Walter knows, because I've never used the cover stitch machine, have no need for it really. And my serger.
Yeah, if you're a quilter, you have no need for a cover stitch machine.
And if you're a quilter, you really don't have any need for a serger. But I have used it on certain projects, very quick projects like placemats, table runners. If you don't want to bother with doing a binding or that kind of thing, you can do a pretty quick job of something, with a finished edge on it using like the rolled hem or just the overlock stitch.
If you're sewing anything like made with jersey, stretch material, knit materials, anything that's stretchy, or if you're using fleece or anything like that, then this is a dream machine for you to use.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do now is just going to switch the camera over. We've got some other things we want to talk about before we end. Okay, so a couple of things that I learned very recently. I was on a virtual retreat on the weekend through the Quilter's Way. And I talked all about that on the latest edition of the Idiot Quilter, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But two things that I learned that weekend. Well, actually, one thing I learned, and one thing another person on there learned about the Janome machines. The Accu-Feed System, which is the very elaborate walking foot, and we've talked about that with the M7 and with the Skyline, the S7 Skyline. And there's a button. And this button has always been there, and it shows 3 upside-down triangles over top of a double line. Now, I thought that button meant that that was raising and lowering your feed dogs, and I think in our video about the Skyline S7, or it might have been the M7, that's what I said it did. Well, I stand corrected, and I've already mentioned this on the Idiot Quilter, but basically, it engages the upper and lower feed dogs of the Accu-Feed system. And that's the beauty of that Accu-Feed system, that it makes your walking foot much more effective, especially when it's pulling through layers of fabric, like if you were doing walking foot quilting on a quilt. Well, one of the people on the retreat, he's had nothing but problems with his Janome machine, and he owns several other types of machines. He owns a FAF machine, and he owns, I think he has a Viking, a Husqvarna.
He has a Bernina.
Or it's a Bernina. It's a Bernina, not a Husqvarna, yeah. And anyways, when it came to quilting, he just didn't want to even use his Janome for that, because he said that the Accu-Feed wasn't working properly. So he asked the question of the group, if they were having problems like this. And some people gave him suggestions about tension and all this kind of stuff. And I said to him, there's a button on it that you need to have turned on in order to use the Accu-Feed system properly. I said, you probably already know about this, because I figured I was the only idiot that didn't know about this. He goes, no, he didn't know about that button. Well, he came back on, and he was as happy as you-know-what in a pile of you-know-what, because it worked beautifully. He said it gave new life to his Janome with that button, because he did not know. And he looked it up in his manual, and they didn't really describe it in the manual either. They mention it, but they don't really explain what it's for. And same in the manual for my M7 as well. So that was a really helpful tip. Well, tip for tat, I guess, because I've been having some trouble with my automatic threader. And everybody does. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Janome, a brother machine, whatever you're using. The technology is the same. It basically drops down, takes a little wire with a hook on the end, puts it through the eye of the needle, picks up your thread, pulls it back through, you're threaded. But that little piece of wire is very susceptible to bending. And if it gets bent, even slightly, and it doesn't align up with the hole in your needle, you're screwed. It doesn't work anymore. Well, my M7, after a month of having it, it just stopped working. And yeah, I can take it into my dealer and get it adjusted and all bit. But if I'm going to take it into the dealer, I'm going to have the whole machine, cleaned up, give it a checkup, the whole bit, fine tune it and everything. Well, I've only had the machine for a month, so usually I do that once a year. So I was just putting up with it, and I was threading it with my Dritz needle threader. Well, this other person, his name's Rob, he put me onto a YouTube video where a guy shows you how to do it yourself. And it's very, very easy. And once I figured that out, it took me about 5 or 7 minutes of fiddling about, because it's very tiny, and seeing it is very, very difficult. You may need a magnifying glass to really get in there. But once you use your screwdriver, you bend it over a little bit. You don't have to bend it too far. Lines it right up. Well, Walter's embroidery machine had the same problem. I fixed it too, all at once, and they are still working fine. So it's an easy adjustment. Now, I describe it a little bit more in this week's Idiot Quilter, episode 111 as well. But I also give you in that video a link to the video that I was talking about on YouTube. And although it's not necessarily the machine that you have, as I said, they're generic. They all work the same way. So you just need a little patience and a screwdriver or a pair of tweezers, and you can adjust it yourself. So that was great for both of us. He learned about the Accu-Feed setting, and I learned how to fix my needle threader. Okay, so last week we talked about how Walter got into sewing. So I'm going to tell you how I got into it. It was all by chance, and it started with a Cricut machine. You know, the electronic die cutting machine. Everybody knows about the Cricut, and I've had several Cricuts over the years. A few years ago, they came out with the Cricut Maker, and the Cricut Maker did a lot of things the other Cricuts didn't do, but one of the things was it came with a small little rotary blade cutter. So now you could cut fabric with it. Now, you could always cut fabric with a Cricut, but you had to do a lot of stuff to prep your fabric beforehand. And of course, you were using a needle. Or not a needle, but like an X-Acto knife blade is what was cutting through your fabric. So if your fabric wasn't stuck down well to your mat, it would tear it up. Rotary cutter, totally different ballgame. And that's how I got started. I got that machine. I started cutting fabric. Well, there was a design for a wall hanging, a very simple one. At the time, I really didn't have a sewing machine to speak of. There were a couple of old ones laying around here. And we happened to be in Costco, and they had a Brother machine for $189. It came with 50 decorative stitches and a whole bunch of other little options. So I thought, hey, I'm going to nail this sucker, because I had no intention of using it for sewing. If I was getting a sewing machine at that price level, I was going to use it for crafting, like basically sewing paper and trying my hand at this, what at the time I considered a bit of a novelty with the Cricut. Well, I kind of liked the first thing I made, and I thought, well, I wonder, are there any quilt stores or something? Because I knew nothing about quilting, and we discovered that there were several in our area, and we went and had a little visit, and I saw a quilt that I really liked. It was a kit, and at that time I didn't know who Kate Fassett was, but I do today. Loved the fabric, brought it home, and I made it. And in the process of making it, I got the quilting bug. But of course, I needed a better sewing machine, because literally the one I bought for $189 from Costco was falling apart. So I went in and saw Shirley at Ultimate Sewing. You've heard us talk about Shirley before in Ultimate Sewing here in Oshawa. And at that time, she didn't know me, I didn't know her, but I came in and I said, I'd like to buy a sewing machine. She says, okay. What's your price range? And I said, I'll go as high as $3,000. Ooh, ka-ching, ka-ching. She went, there are a lot of models here that are under that price that might be of interest. So she took me through them, and I bought the 6700P, which we've already talked about, and haven't looked back since. So that's really how I got into quilting, and haven't looked back. I've always been a crafter, but this is well, not so new for me now, but something that I still like. And you know what really appeals to me about quilting? The machines. I love machines. And there's so many machines, as we showed you today and over the last few weeks. So that's how I got into quilting. Okay, so anything you want to say to the people related to today's topic or anything?
I'm sure there's like much more I could do with machines that I've shown you today. But I haven't really touched on everything on that. But it is really worthwhile to have a quality machine.
Yeah. You get what you pay for, quite frankly. Like I said, I bought this Brother for $189, and within only a couple of months, I had pieces dropping off of it. So, you know.
A lot of people get uptight, well, it's going to cost a lot of money and all this other
yes,
stuff.
It is.
And it does. It's an initial outlay. But once you've got something, I don't look back, and it's a really good investment, especially if you're going to do something, you're dedicated to doing a certain type of craft. It's worthwhile to spend a little bit of money to get something that works well.
Yeah, and it's a hobby. Hobbies cost money. It's just like that. I mean, if there's no such thing as a cheap hobby. It doesn't matter
No,
whether
actually,
you're a scrapbooker or a sewer or whatever.
There are very few hobbies where you can say, oh, well, it happens to be with sewing, you need a sewing machine. So,
You know,
unless you're hand sewing. But
so just depending on how serious you are about your hobby, then it's an investment. It's an investment in your creative potential. So, anyways, I think that's it for this episode of So Chatty. Our next episode, we're going to be looking at about machine embroidery, and particularly looking at the Janome 550E embroidery machine. And we'll be talking a lot about embroidery and what we have learned, because next to making quilts, embroidering is one of my favorite things. Walter's too. He's done a lot.
Fun.
It's fun. It is. It's fun, fun, fun. Okay, so thanks for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the comment section below, and there'll be some links to Janome sites and links to these two machines that we showed you today as well in the show notes, so check those out. So have a great week. Stay healthy. Stay happy. Stay healthy. Go and sew something pretty. And we'll see you next week. Bye for now. Say goodbye, Walter.
Goodbye, Walter.
Yeah, remember your name.